Good morning. My name is Diane Marie Amon. I am the Emily and Ernest Woodruff Chair in International Law and the faculty co-director of the Dean Rusk International Law Center at the University of Georgia School of Law. And I'm a counselor in the American Society of International Law and very honored to be back at ASIL for the 113th annual meeting of the American Society of International Law and to have the honor of leading this roundtable, which is aimed at exploring contemporary security governance issues. The title of our roundtable is Challenges and Prospects for International Peace and Security, the United Nations Peacekeeping, NATO, and the UDHR at 70. 70, as you might have guessed, refers to the 70th anniversary. All three of these regimes were founded in either 1948 or 1949. UN Peacekeeping, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They're three very different entities, yet they arise out of the same or a similar impetus. They exist in separate spheres, and yet they overlap both in a normative and sometimes in an operational space. It is those connects and disconnects that we will explore today, against the backdrop, of course, of the current geopolitical and global legal climate, about which many of us heard a lot yesterday during the Grotius lecture from the lecturer and our distinguished discussant. We have many questions that we would like to answer, and I would like to get to them as soon as possible, but I hope you'll bear with me on a few housekeeping matters before that. First, I would like to thank Jessie Clark, a member of the Office of the Attorney General of the Government of Australia, for organizing this panel, conceptualizing it, and bringing this wonderful group of speakers to you today. I also am asked to tell you that anyone who is seeking CLE credit must find one of the ASIL volunteers and check in, and do so immediately. I am also finding that my laptop doesn't want to advance the page as easily as I thought. You will not get credit for CLE unless you have registered. Our format today is not going to be a talking heads panel. This is really designed to be a free discussion in a roundtable manner. We will begin with very brief, I have my timer ready, opening remarks from our four participants, sort of outlining the origin story, if you will, of their regime and talking a little bit about some of the issues. We will then go to a round, if you will, of question and answers that I will pose and discussion among the participants. And our hope is that in the last third of this panel, we will open the floor for question and answers, and I will talk to you a little bit more about that in due course. Our speakers here are Michael Doyle, to my far left, university professor at the Columbia University, affiliated with the School of International and Public Affairs, the Department of Political Science, and the Law School. Among his many distinguished achievements and accomplishments, he held the post at one time of Assistant Secretary General and Special Advisor to Kofi Annan, whom, as we all know, was then the UN Secretary General. To my far right, is Stephen Hill, who is the legal advisor and director of the Office of Legal Affairs at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. Among his many former positions is deputy legal advisor at the United States Mission in the United Nations, as well as practice with many international justice mechanisms. Closest to me on the right is Bruce Ozzy Oswald, who is a professor and director of the Asia Pacific Center for Military Law at the Melbourne Law School. He served as a legal officer in the Australian Regular Army in theaters including Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, East Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He's worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross and was a fellow at one time of the U.S. Institute of Peace. And then finally, to my immediate left is Rita Simeon, who is the International Legal Counsel at Human Rights First, where she focuses on national security and counterterrorism issues. Rita teaches as an adjunct both at Georgetown Law and at the American University Washington College of Law, And before coming to Human Rights First, she was a lawyer at the Constitution Project. Without further ado, I'd like to begin our first round of discussion and ask this question to each of the panelists. Each of you has worked within at least one of the treaty regimes whose anniversary we mark with this roundtable. Choosing one of the three, please tell us the nature and significance of this 70th anniversary. And we're going to begin with Rita, who will be talking to us. Oh, excuse me. We're going to begin with Oz in chronological order, who will talk to us about the founding of UN peacekeeping.
Thanks very much, Diane, and welcome, and thank you very much, Jesse, for allowing me to be on this panel, and the same to Azel. The United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, UNSO, was the first peacekeeping mission established by the United Nations, and it remains in the Middle East to monitor ceasefires, supervise armistice agreements, prevent isolated incidences from escalating, and assisting other UN peacekeeping operations in the region. The military personnel serving on the mission are classified as military observers, and consequently, they are unarmed. Their mandate is given to them by the Security Council. The UNSO military observers have been used in a number of ways since the operation was established. For example, UNSO military observers are attached to peacekeeping forces in the Middle East, such as the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, UNDOF, and the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL. They've also been used at short notice to establish peacekeeping forces elsewhere in the world. UN peacekeeping forces have come a long way since 1948. While it is true that UNSO's mandate remains pretty much as it was in 49, UN peacekeeping has nonetheless become multifaceted and multidimensional. The Security Council mandates missions to cover everything from observing ceasefires to state building by assisting local authorities to establish institutions and law and order. In relation to the normative framework, the legal framework surrounding these operations, UNSO was a very important moment in the development of what I refer to as UN peacekeeping or UN peacekeeping normative frameworks. First, it was the start of what I would refer to for our purposes of discussion today, a sui generis area of law and practice that continues to grow. The following norms were articulated in relation to UNSO and remain fundamental to understanding contemporary UN peacekeeping operations. First, putting to the forefront the role of the Security Council in maintaining international peace and security by commanding and controlling UN peacekeeping operations. Second, the practice of the Security Council delegating powers to the Secretary General in the context of managing UN peacekeeping operations. Third, the accountability of the operation through the Security Council. Each of these three legal issues relating to who can establish, who has accountability, and how they're managed all started with UNSO and they remain current for peacekeeping operations today. UNSO also permitted a narrative to be established that UN peacekeeping existed to maintain the peace. Such operations were there to ensure that conflict did not break out again. Today, it is much more complicated because several UN operations are focused on establishing peace so as to be able to maintain it. Such examples exist in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Central African Republic. This shift has had considerable impact on the UN peacekeeping normative framework as it has introduced legal issues such as the application of the laws of armed conflict to UN peacekeeping operations, the use of force in self-defense, the use of force to defend the mandate, and the use of force to protect civilians. I'll speak about protecting of civilians later this morning. The next major issue is that there was a great deal of unsettled law and practice concerning UN peacekeeping in 1948. Today, this is not the case. Developments in such areas as the status of peacekeepers, the use of force on peacekeeping operations, third-party responsibility, and the Articles of Responsibility of International Organizations that were drafted by the International Law Commission directly impact on the UN and its subsidiary organs. And of course, the list goes on. I'm not saying that all aspects of law relating to peacekeepers is settled. My point is quite simply that the law has evolved to take into account contemporary challenges.
Excellent. With military rigor, he has finished his first intervention well ahead of the scheduled time. Rita, I am now going to turn to you to talk about the December 10, 1948 adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the world since then.
Great, thank you. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as most everyone in this room I'm sure knows, is the cornerstone of the modern human rights movement as well as today's legal framework. Though the historical and philosophical roots enshrined in the Declaration go back centuries, if not longer, the Universal Declaration itself emerged much more recently, of course, out of the devastation of the Holocaust, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression. Following these horrific events, delegates from the newly formed United Nations, including a drafting committee that was made up of representatives from a wide range of countries, from Lebanon, France, Chile, Australia, China, the UK, and at the time the USSR, labored for 2 years under the leadership of the US delegate, Eleanor Roosevelt. The committee drafted an instrument with input eventually from over 50 member nations that provided content to the groundbreaking commitment that member states had made in the UN Charter to make respect for human rights and promotion of fundamental freedoms a shared global priority for the first time. The declaration that they drafted articulated a set of fundamental rights shared equally by all human beings that were universal, interdependent, and indivisible. The significance of their work was not lost on them at the time. One of the members of the drafting subcommittee, Hernan Santa Cruz of Chile, wrote, "I perceived clearly that I was participating in a truly significant historic event in which a consensus had been reached as to the supreme value of the human person, a value that did not originate in the decision of a worldly power, but rather in the fact of existing." He went on to add that there was an atmosphere of genuine solidarity and brotherhood among men and women from all latitudes, the like of which I have not seen again in any international setting. In Paris, then, on December 10th, 1948, the General Assembly voted to approve the declaration. The vote was 48-0 with 8 abstentions. And in doing so, the nations of the world recognized that basic rights and fundamental freedoms are inherent to all human beings and are equally applicable to everyone, everywhere, regardless of nationality, place of residence, gender, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. 70 years later, this declaration has been translated into more than 500 languages around the world. It holds the Guinness Book of World Records for this, has spawned a vast human rights legal architecture, including 2 binding international covenants, and then has also inspired a growing body now of more than 80 international human rights treaties and declarations around the world, several regional human rights conventions, and countless domestic, legislative, and constitutional provisions that give legal force, both internationally and primarily at the domestic level, to the rights and freedoms first articulated in the Declaration. Despite this impressive global influence and legal architecture, it is fair to ask, after 70 years, whether the Universal Declaration and the human rights movement more broadly has delivered on its original promise. There are no shortage of critics who point to human rights abuses around the globe or to existing gaps in enforcement and accountability as proof that this human rights experiment of the last 70 years has failed. But I think that the drafters of the Declaration and human rights advocates around the world and drafters of the subsequent treaties and domestic provisions were not so naive as to think that these instruments would cure the world of all human rights abuses. The text of the Declaration itself makes it clear that the rights it sets forth are a benchmark that we should all, as individuals, as states, as organizations, should be striving towards, and that the rights therein would be realized incrementally through progressive measures. And the progress that we have made in the 70 years since has truly been revolutionary. Human rights violations within the sovereign territory of a state are now the official business of all other states. The Universal Declaration and treaties that followed continue to serve as critical tools for human rights defenders and activists around the world, playing a role in the ousting of repressive regimes from Latin America to the Soviet bloc, ending apartheid, and fighting back against all forms of discrimination. Nevertheless, our work is not done. One need only glance at the daily headlines from Yemen to Venezuela to see just how much work remains today. But anniversaries like this one provide an important opportunity for us to take stock of the current challenges and prepare to adapt where new approaches and strategies are warranted. And I look forward to having a discussion about some of those challenges and opportunities.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rita. I'll now turn to Steve, who is going to be talking to us, no surprise to anyone, about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As many of you know, that treaty was signed on 4 April 1949, and the 70th anniversary celebration, in fact, will be next week. It entered into force on 24 August 1949, so it's in fact celebrating a double anniversary, if you will. Steve.
Well, thanks so much, Diane, and thank you for the plug for our 70th anniversary celebration, which is going to be here in Washington next week, hosted by Secretary Pompeo with the foreign ministers of our 29 NATO allies, plus our newest ally hasn't joined yet. It's we're waiting for national ratifications, the Republic of North Macedonia. So NATO is sort of 30 allies at 70, which I think is something very important for us. The North Atlantic Treaty itself, which I think it was on one of the slides that was flashing through, is actually on display from now until Tuesday at the National Archives. If I wouldn't want to pull you away, of course, from the programming here, but if you want to go actually see the original, it's on display, which is something that's is quite extraordinary. I really appreciate this panel because often in the world of international organizations and security, we're quite siloized. You know, we always talk about NATO as the most successful military alliance in history and the strongest alliance, the strongest political military alliance. But I think when we step back on the occasion of these anniversaries, you realize just how much the architecture is interlinked. So what I thought I would kind of just explain, given the 70th anniversary now of the treaty, is maybe how the treaty itself actually brings that forward. You know, if you look at it's a very short treaty, 14 articles, the North Atlantic Treaty. We often call it the Washington Treaty after this very city. It's an extremely short treaty. It's kind of very old school. It only has 14 articles, but it's proven extremely adaptable over the years. You asked about the origin story of the regime, as you called it, Diane, and I guess the origin story of our regime is one that is no longer really applicable. We're not in the Cold War anymore. We don't want a Cold War. We don't want a return to the Cold War. We've had the history of NATO has been one of successfully deterring and conducting whatever mission really is required of it. So over the course of the Cold War, you had 40 years of very successful deterrence. In the 90s, you had the challenges in the Western Balkans, challenges in Europe itself. After 9/11, of course, and let's remember that 9/11 is the only time that Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty has ever been invoked. So it was invoked in favor of of course, of the attacks on the United States and in the collective self-defense of the United States. NATO took a role a major role in the international response in Afghanistan, and we're still there. Nowadays, of course, given the security environment in Europe, we're in the middle of the largest reinforcement of Europe's collective defense since the end of the Cold War. We've established small headquarters along the eastern flank of the alliance. We've stepped up our presence in the Black Sea. We've worked in the Mediterranean. Are supporting the coalition to defeat ISIS. We've just set up a new training mission in Iraq that's led by Canada. And we're focusing on how we can work better together with the European Union so that when you look at the future of the United States and Canada and our European allies, we're not dealing with a situation where you have lots of stovepiping and duplication, but rather coordinated efforts to improve security. So let me just walk you through the Washington Treaty just in my few remaining minutes here to show how really, the treaty itself shows how much we're linked to all of these other regimes that we're talking about today. We're going to be a number of legal advisors within the NATO system. There are some of us in Brussels at our Supreme headquarters, which are located in Shape in southern Belgium and also in Norfolk, Virginia, but also folks who are deployed in various NATO operations, Afghanistan, Kosovo. We've all kind of banded together with a few friends from the outside to put together an anniversary edition of the Emory International Law Journal that's going to kind of be a practitioner's commentary to the North Atlantic Treaty. That'll be coming out this fall, so I'd commend it to your attention. We're trying to do an article by article kind of commentary a little bit on the treaty. What's really significant, I think, when you look at the North Atlantic Treaty, and I hope the slide comes up of it eventually, it really is of a piece with all of these 1948 and 1949 documents. So the preamble of the North Atlantic Treaty talks about the values that NATO is meant to defend. And the values that it talks about are democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. I stand to be corrected, but I actually believe that this is the first real reference to the term rule of law, état de droit, in an international treaty of this sort. And I've challenged people on numerous occasions to disprove me. When I served at the UN, we often had these debates about the nature of the concept of the rule of law. I see a lot of some heads nodding in the audience, and is this a true international concept, and is there such a thing as the rule of law? At least here's a reference to it in a multilateral treaty. The first article of the North Atlantic Treaty, which if it comes up on the screen, you can look at together with me, is a reaffirmation of the Pacific settlement of disputes in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So in the siloized world of today's IOs, you might not think of that as being Article 1 of the North Atlantic Treaty, but it is. Article 2 of the North Atlantic Treaty is often attributed to our friends from Canada, and particularly Lester Pearson, the notion of economic and social coordination. Not exactly something you would think about in connection with NATO, but it very much, we're on this, still on the UDHR, but we're coming up soon, but coordination of economic and social policies amongst allies. And so if you remember 1949, the Marshall Plan, the real recognition that the only way that human rights and security can be realized is through economic and social development. That's right in the North Atlantic Treaty. And while NATO is certainly not an organization that does kind of economic policy and social policy, we do a tremendous amount of what I would call regulatory work in the military sphere. We work on establishing standards of things like training on IHL, or law of armed conflict. We do actually do quite a bit of that kind of policy coordination. I think this reference in Article 2 shows you also how NATO and the European Union are very much related in terms of their aims. Of course, NATO predated the European Union, but I think the idea is still the same. Article 3 talks about the continuous need for mutual self-help and coordination amongst allies. That's the basis for kind of the constant consultation that happens within NATO. And then just to conclude my brief comments here, we have Articles 4 and 5, which are really the operative parts of the treaty. Article 4 provides for consultation when any ally feels that it's threatened. It's been something that was hardly, a little bit like Chapter 7 of the UN Charter in a way. It was never really invoked or over the course of the Cold War, but it's had a bit of a renaissance. So Poland invoked Article 4 after the invasion of Crimea. Turkey has used Article 4 in response to threats coming from Syria. And then Article 5, collective self-defense, which I'll get into later. That's 8 minutes. Thank you.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you so much. And we will all stop and pause and look at the North Atlantic Treaty when it appears on the slide. I'm almost certain there is one there, but we got a bit out of sync. All right. Michael is going to be our utility fielder here. And so I leave you to draw some connections or speak about one individually, whichever you prefer.
Thank you very much, Diane. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to start by saying that I join my three panelists in celebrating these epic-making international orders, genuine accomplishments in the post-war period. That said, I'm going to talk about some historical and political relations among these three regimes. And I think almost inevitably some of my remarks will therefore be critical. So that's why I want to join the celebration first before I make a few critical remarks. I want to talk about geopolitical context that puts these three regimes together. I want to talk about the complementary contrast in a geopolitical sense amongst the three regimes. NATO, as we know, was the pillar of the Western Cold War alliance. Human rights and peacekeeping, on the other hand, flourished when the Cold War waned after 1988. And now that we're seeing the emergence of what some are calling a new Cold War, we're seeing great stress on both peacekeeping and human rights. But ironically, it's not leading to the revival of NATO that one might expect given its flourishing during the Cold War. So let me tie some of these three things together with noting first three eras. The first era, the first or Cold War I, begins about 1948 and runs through 1988. The second is the post-Cold War liberal primacy, well, let's call it that, from 1989 through 2012. And now there's a threat of an emergence of a new Cold War starting in about 2012, call it Cold War II. Look at the first Cold War. Human rights sort of squeaked in at the beginning of the Cold War. As Rita very nicely mentioned, it was a joint enterprise of various ideologies coming together, from Eleanor Roosevelt's social democracy through the Christian democracy of some of the European leaders, through third world developmentalism coming from Charles Malik and others, Humphrey from Canada and his thorough liberalism, René Cassin and others managed to keep together an ideological amalgam that could have easily spread apart, but in the glow of the World War II United Nations alliance held together. And as Rita also mentioned, it passed in the GA with no negative votes, 48 positive votes, and 8 abstentions. But look at the abstentions. We're already beginning to see a flavor of the Cold War. There are USSR, Belarus, and Ukraine, all of which were actually the same thing, but due to a quirk, were given separate votes. Included as well Yugoslavia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, the beginning of the Eastern Bloc. And then for obvious reasons, the other abstainers were South Africa and Saudi Arabia. So we're beginning to see the emergence of tension. This tension grows on human rights so that we see 2 separate regimes, civil and political, the Western, economic and social, the Eastern. When we come to peacekeeping, Oz, I think, gave us a wonderful introduction to UNSO. And what we see peacekeeping emerging in the Cold War context is a very limited enterprise, what's often called first-generation peacekeeping, designed to monitor a truce and applicable in only those areas where the US and the Soviets thought that they wanted to isolate a conflict rather than make it central to their relationship. And that's because this Cold War that had emerged was a truly serious, fundamental, revolutionary conflict that pitted states that were waging something like a war, but without military means. They were using subversion, covert action, propaganda, cultural, industrial competition, and then proxy wars in the third world. And this then made NATO an absolutely essential function, bringing the Western powers together as a way to confront the Warsaw Pact. When we move to the post-Cold War, jumping quickly, late 1980s, Gorbachev deserves a great deal of the credit for both loosening the Eastern Bloc with the new Sinatra doctrine, allowing East European countries to do it my way, and also the move toward democracy, which he defined as a fundamental value of socialism at his 1985 Congress Party speech. At the UN in 1988, he went even further, and he declared that human rights are human values, not just owned by the West or the East, but common to all human beings. And this we saw then flourish in the human rights regime of the post-Cold War period, with the Vienna Declaration in 1993, announcing that human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated, meaning that the old divide between civic and political and economics and social no longer had an ethical or a legal reality. With peacekeeping, we also see a great deepening of the peacekeeping regime, beginning with the Agenda for Peace in 1992. Peacekeeping flourished. The quality of the mandates deepened. They went beyond first-generation monitoring of a truce to second-generation peace building, helping to reconstruct societies, to what called third-generation peace enforcement and the protection of civilians. There were 13 peacekeeping operations between 1948 and 1988. That is about 3 per decade. Between 1988 and 2010, there were 53. That's 26 per decade. Peacekeeping had suddenly become a much more functional aspect of the United Nations. NATO, on the other hand, with the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, enters an identity crisis period. Some of my colleagues in international relations rashly predicted that NATO would disappear. You should never predict as a social scientist, unless you add in enough years that you'll be dead by the time the prediction is validated. Needless to say, NATO did not collapse. Indeed, it expanded, and it expanded into Eastern Europe. And it undertook new missions, and I'm wrapping up right here, in peacekeeping and in peace enforcement in Afghanistan, peacekeeping in the Balkans. But budgets fell and readiness slipped. We now get to the new Cold War, and this is my last 2 minutes. In 2012, we saw the return of Putin to power and of Xi declaring himself to be the permanent ruler of China. These were major steps. In the West, we see significant sources of alarm. With regard to cyber threats, as we know, the US, UK, and French intelligence services have all issued statements that they regard Mr. Putin as having waged a concerted campaign to interfere in the electoral politics of these 3 countries in 2016. China is seen as a geostrategic rival by the West and also engaging in industrial espionage and technology theft. These are new tensions. On the eastern side of the relationship, we see in the emergence in Russia of resentment of the collapse of the Soviet Union and its empire, great concerns about the provocation of color revolutions in the East is seen as a threat to itself. China feels it's being contained. All of this is a function of a new emerging tension rooted in nationalist corporatist autocracies like Russia and China, and liberal capitalist democracies like the US, Western Europe, and elsewhere that have institutional incapabilities. What we see then is a way in which peacekeeping and human rights are under challenge. The US is withdrawn from the Human Rights Council. Peacekeeping, there have been only 5 of them since 2010 again, and the Security Council was by and large AWOL when it came to Syria. Now, you would think that this would produce a revival of NATO as an institution to help protect from Putin's challenges, potentially challenges from China, even though it's not within the mandate, but nonetheless, Putin is the central element of that. And you would think so, but instead what we see is something different emerging. Yes, there have been increases in the NATO budget between 2014 and today. The European and Canadian contributions have radically increased in dollar terms, but at the same time, great strife has emerged in the institution. And I wrap up with a quote from 2 former ambassadors to NATO, Nicholas Burns and Douglas Lute, in their new book, NATO at 70, An Alliance in Crisis. The single greatest challenge NATO faces today is the critical need for reviving strong, reliable American leadership. At the most basic level, the next American president must pledge in both words and deeds to reaffirm a commitment to the alliance. Given the opportunity to do so, within months of his inauguration in May of 2017, President Trump refused to honor the U.S. commitment to Article 5, even while unveiling a memorial at the new NATO headquarters commemorating the historic invocation of Article 5 in 9/11. So ironically, this new Cold War is putting human rights and peacekeeping under great stress, but has not led to a strong revival of NATO. And for the reasons just expressed, Donald Trump is the leader of a liberal capitalist democracy, but few would describe his ideology as liberalism, from the broad sense of that term, running everything of a Lockean sort, from Bernie Sanders to Paul Ryan. He would not be called a liberal, and thus a crisis that I think we're in the middle of. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And your timing was perfect, Michael, because we do have the preamble for the North Atlantic Treaty here. And you see that the second line is they are determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. I can't resist the fact that Michael has essentially laid down a gauntlet for Stephen to pick up. But let me broaden it out, because I really want this to be a roundtable of 4 or 5 persons and not just 1 or 2. I like the metaphor that you used of the Cold War as the Cold War, the interim period, if you will, halftime, and the new Cold War. And I think we could spin that out to think not only about what appears to be a return, perhaps, to proxy conflicts, return to nationalisms over internationalisms, much greater fragility of human rights and democracy, and see if each of our panelists might want to contribute what this notion of a new Cold War understood to include pushback against multilateralism, as well as a renewal of sometimes hard to identify and even if easily identified, intractable conflicts. I think of ranging from what's happening in Myanmar to what's happening in Syria. How are your regimes challenged by that? What are their responses to it? And also, what about these big dogs in the room, China, Russia, and the United States? What role of leadership ought they to be playing, and how do your regimes respond to the role of leadership that the administrations in each of those countries is choosing to take at the moment? I think that's enough questions to tee up to get you to say something interesting. But I think we need to start with Stephen because of Michael's challenge.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. And no, I appreciate what Michael said. I mean, it's, you were citing, Michael, the report now by Nick Burns, Doug Lute, about NATO and alliance in crisis. I mean, I think that's fine. I think NATO can own the idea that there are always challenges. That's part of the strength of the alliance and its adaptability. My Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, former Prime Minister of Norway, always talks about how, there have always been disagreements amongst the allies. The Suez Crisis almost derailed NATO right from the start. We'll be coming up on the anniversary of that in maybe less than a decade. So that almost derailed NATO from the start. The Iraq War in 2003, that was a serious challenge to NATO. And so I don't think people in NATO think of us being in a new Cold War in using that construct. I think that there are many differences between the security environment today and the time of the Cold War. I mean, not among other things, just the openness of society that is brought about by the internet, by communication, by the fact that we're not dealing with 2 essentially hermetically sealed universes. Of course, Russia and what Russia has done is a major source of concern that's why we're building up the collective defense in the way that I described, and the US is participating in that. So I talked about how NATO is setting up 5 new small headquarters along the eastern flank of NATO. Those are led by, various allies, including allies that often are portrayed as not contributing to the alliance, like Germany or others. Germany is leading one of these. The UK is leading one of these. France is leading one of these. But in parallel with these NATO headquarters, we actually have a massive US investment. It's called the European Defense Initiative in European defense and deterrence. And so it's a much more complicated environment. We still have the NATO-Russia Council, which was an institutional, that's a piece actually of the post-Cold War architecture, maybe not very studied, but it still continues to meet 3 or 4 times a year, even in this atmosphere. And we try to find places where, while we maintain a very strong deterrence posture about Russia, we also look for dialogue with them. So we look for dialogue about how to prevent incidents in the Baltic Sea, in the High North, military incidents. We have cooperated with Russia on quite a number of things. We have to deconflict what, not necessarily NATO, but some states are doing in the coalition against Syria. So I would say the environment is more complicated. But that said, at NATO we try to own these challenges. We try to embrace them because ultimately they're a source of strength. Thank you.
Rita, why don't you jump in here?
Yeah, so the organization I work for, Human Rights First, is actually premised on the idea that U.S. leadership on human rights is critical. So I would agree with Michael that this presents a real problem, that the U.S. has gone from really leading, with Eleanor Roosevelt being the sort of leading voice and champion for the Universal Declaration, to where we are today with, as Michael mentioned, the U.S. Actually withdrawing from the Human Rights Council. And U.S. leadership is needed not just in promoting and pushing a human rights agenda around the world, but the U.S. also needs to be leading by example, by respecting human rights in its actions at home and abroad, so that it actually has the moral authority to go out and be impressing upon other countries that they need to respect human rights as well. It's really hard to do that when they can point to your own abuses. And the work that I do is really looking at the role of the U.S. in counterterrorism operations since 9/11. And there are plenty of examples from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib to the killing of civilians in drone strikes, for other countries to point to our own practices, for them to ignore us when we're trying to point out their own human rights abuses. But I think we have also a more fundamental challenge for those of us who are working to try to push the U.S. To be a leader on human rights, is to persuade those in power in the U.S. that it's actually in the national interests of the U.S. to be a leader on human rights and to be promoting human rights. That not only are human rights sort of intrinsically valuable, but they also serve other important national interests. And this was really the sort of premise behind not just the UN Charter, but the UDHR as well, that human rights, respect for human rights, is really actually fundamental to peace and security in the world. When you can look to any conflict, any internal conflict around the world, and find human rights abuses sort of at the core of the origins of that conflict. And so it's really, it's a critical relationship between respect for human rights and peace and security. And therefore, states like the U.S. need to not think of this as a squishy, touchy-feely, oh, it'd be nice to have, but it's actually really essential for national security as well.
Right. Bruce?
First, let me thank Steve for challenging the notion of the rule of law in its birth. I will now sleep well. No, it's excellent. I'm so pleased that someone's actually been able to find out where that term that means everything to everyone and nothing to anyone came from. So yeah, that's I'll now have my students entertained with trying to find their source of that term even before the NATO agreement. So law, politics and diplomacy in the maintenance of international peace and security are, of course, interlinked. My focus is really upon asking the question, so in this framework of politics and diplomacy, how's the law in the maintenance of international peace and security shaped up? And I'd have to say pretty well. So if you look at the foundation of if you look at the Charter as the foundation for maintaining international peace and security, I'd have to say that right from the reparations case, which also celebrates its 70th anniversary this year, 11th of April, 1949, the ICJ passed on its judgment on the reparations case, decided that the organisation must be deemed to have those powers, which, though not expressly provided for in the Charter, are conferred upon it by necessary implication as being essential to the performance of its duties. And of course, the Security Council has maintained that ability to interpret its powers in an implied manner. Peacekeeping would not exist today unless the Security Council had adopted, and the General Assembly for that matter, but unless the Security Council had adopted that approach. The certain expenses case in 1964 also reaffirmed the principle that the Security Council had primary, though not exclusive, responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. And again, no matter what has happened in the three phases that Michael has spoken about, Cold War, interim, and the new Cold War, it still seems to me, from where I sit, that the Security Council is, of course, continues to maintain that primary role. It's another point that Steve raised about the role that NATO is playing in such a broad arena today. Of course, that stems from Article 8 of the UN Charter, which gives regional arrangements a powerful role and a powerful voice in the maintenance of international peace and security. The caveat being, of course, that if there is a use of force being envisaged under the regional arrangement, it must go through the Security Council. Again, the law mutually reinforcing fundamental principles of politics and diplomacy to bring it to a central place where, of course, the rule of law has an actual impact upon the way that business is conducted. NATO's role, the African Union's role, the European Union's role in peacekeeping and in maintaining international peace and security still continues because of this impact. And the last point I'll mention, I'm going to read his issue about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In my peacekeeping experience, which goes back to the early 90s with the deployments to Cambodia and to Somalia, and then myself as a peacekeeper in Rwanda, I've seen human rights being embedded in peacekeeping operations much, much more strongly than they ever have been. And I'll give two examples of where law and policy are coming into play in the context of politics and diplomacy as, two paradigms that sometimes are quite opposed. The first one is the human rights due diligence policy, which the UN has issued, which seeks to ensure that the UN and its peacekeepers don't breach international legal obligations by supporting non-UN forces to commit internationally wrongful acts. And the second is the myriad of cross-cutting thematic resolutions, women, peace and security, children in armed conflict, protection in civilians, and sexual exploitation and abuse. All these resolutions reinforce fundamental human rights. So I'm a little bit more positive about where we sit today. And I think there's been, considerable movement into the area of the rule of law and how that plays out in the politics diplomacy context.
I'm very pleased for the optimistic note, Ozzy. I think one of the things that I really took to heart from the Grotius lecture yesterday was Professor Orford's clarion call for paying more attention to, in her words, the populism that's good, and her concern that maybe there is too much attention paid to problems and not enough to positive movements. So I take your comments somewhat in that vein. Michael, have you any responses to these interventions?
Yes, no, I thought the interventions were wonderful, and again, bringing up the strengths of these three very important regimes. One thing I didn't get to cover was some degree of qualification about this new Cold War that some of us have identified, because I think it's quite important. Steve raised this. The level of hostility is nowhere yet like it was during the height of the first Cold War. We have to remember, just as late as 2011, when Mr. Medvedev was the president of Russia, Russia voted with the U.S. And the French and the British on the Libya case, imposing strong sanctions. And when it came to the use of force resolution, the one a few weeks later, they abstained when they could have vetoed. So we're not very far from potentials of cooperation. And there are other major areas of potential cooperation that still exist that we did not find in quite the same way during the Cold War. With China, for example, the U.S. makes common ground on specific ways regard to North Korea. For the Europeans, China is a much better ally on climate change than is the U.S., and these are significant complications. Moreover, all states today, as I think Steve mentioned, are much more economically interdependent, so that if we had a real heavy-duty Cold War II emerging, the cost would be much greater than the cost of the first Cold War. The first Cold War cost the U.S. in defense dollars alone $12 trillion. Those are in 1980 dollars, a lot of money. If we got into an equivalent kind of an arms race with China, which has a population 3 times the old Soviet and 3 times the rate of growth of the old Soviet Union, we would face incredible devastation for all other prospects of human development if we had to invest in a real arms race with China in the years ahead. So my 2 points are there are very good reasons to avoid a replay of the Cold War. But I would like to just point out that we have some of these dangers, and the Europeans recognized them last week in a resolution where they spoke about the threat posed by autocracy to European institutions. And they issued a clarion cry. It passed by not unanimity, but by a 2/3 vote through the European Parliament about the dangers that they saw being faced. So I think we should take those seriously, but not panic, not exaggerate them, and above all, not stop working to try to mitigate them, because the cost of falling into another Cold War, an extreme Cold War, is just nearly unimaginable.
Thank you. There was already a mention that this is by no means the only 3 regimes that are marking milestone 70th anniversaries. Just a few that come to mind are simply a day before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, the General Assembly adopted the Convention Against Genocide. In August of 1949, we saw the adoption of the 4 Geneva Conventions on the Loss of War. In January 1948, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, or the GATT. April 1948, the World Health Organization and OECD. And then, dear to my heart, in November 1948, the judgment of the Tokyo Tribunal, as well as in May 1949, the judgment in the last of the 12 trials known as the Nuremberg Military Tribunal trials. And so what I'd like to ask the panelists is if any of these anniversaries is one that you would like to bring into the discussion. Is there any of these regimes that are important for the one that you've been asked to talk about, something that is integral to the success or the reason for the challenges to your regime? And I'm going to start with Rita on this question.
Yeah, so the relationship between the law of armed conflict and human rights law, I think, is a very important one today. Much of the work that I focus on the national security context, and particularly the U.S. military operations abroad, is, where we're actually clearly operating in the context of an armed conflict. We're pushing the U.S. to be complying with the law of armed conflict, and challenging in some ways their reading and interpretation of the law of armed conflict. But we're also really working on the interplay and relationship between the two. And in today's world, what concerns me is there's the development and rise of the law of armed conflict sort of along one track, and the development and the rise of human rights law on a different track, and much less attention paid to how they should interact with one another in a practical way. So there's a lot of academic scholarship out there that's really interesting, but in the real world, it's much harder to find simple, practical ways when you've got folks operating on the ground extraterritorially for them to figure out which rules they should be applying when. And what we end up seeing with the rise of non-state terrorist groups, organized armed groups that are operating across national boundaries, in states like the US that are fighting them across national boundaries in many different countries around the world, this default application of the law of armed conflict in situations that don't look very much like the ones that the law of armed conflict and the Geneva Conventions were really designed to address. I see some of the world's best law of armed conflict scholars sitting here today, so I'll be really careful about what I say, but to my mind, the Geneva Conventions and the law of armed conflict more broadly is an incredibly important regime, but that it should be applied in armed conflict situations. And I see a tendency for those who really want to have the protections of the Geneva Conventions and Common Article 3 in particular, they want to see that regime applied as broadly as possible. And indeed, that was the intent at the time, right? You can actually go to the drafting history and see language that says we want Common Article 3 to apply and these protections to apply as broadly as possible. The problem is when you are applying those protections at the expense of applying the much greater protections of human rights law and displacing those stronger protections by calling situations armed conflict or applying armed conflict rules far from sort of battlefield scenarios that those rules were designed for. So I think that's it's an important relationship and a really significant challenge that's not going away anytime soon.
Thank you. Bruce.
So I want to focus on the Genocide Convention and the Geneva Conventions. April 2019 will mark 25 years since the Rwanda genocide commenced. If I was a Rwandan, I would be terribly cynical about the relevance of that convention to UN peacekeeping operations. However, having said that, the convention remains relevant for the following reasons. First, it's relevant in the use of armed force by peacekeepers to prevent any act of genocide. Such actions would at least be consistent with the general mandate of protecting civilians. Second, the broad obligation to prevent genocide means that peacekeepers must report and, where appropriate, investigate allegations concerning genocide. Third, the obligation to prevent and punish those who commit the act of genocide might give rise to peacekeepers detaining persons accused of such crimes until such time that the person can be handed over to local authorities. The Security Council Resolution 2211 concerning MONUSCO authorized peacekeepers to support and work with authorities of the Democratic Republic of Congo to arrest and bring to justice those allegedly responsible for genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity, and violations against international humanitarian law and violations or abuses of human rights. So that regime remains fundamental, I think, to the whole notion of the protection of civilians. There can be an interesting question as to whether the notion of protection of civilians creates an obligation that peacekeepers must protect civilians or gives them a right to protect civilians. And we can have that discussion during question time. The application of the law of armed conflict to UN peacekeepers is something that many people have written on, but no one, I think, doubts that the law is relevant to peacekeepers. There are at least three ways in which it's relevant. First, peacekeepers might be mandated to stop, report, monitor, and investigate grave breaches of laws of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. Second, the question of when to peacekeepers carry out their operations. there might be circumstances in which they have to comply with the law of armed conflict. The Secretary General's Bulletin of 1999 addresses this matter. So clearly the Security Council and the UN have identified it as an important matter. Similarly, the Security Council Resolution 2277 concerning MONUSCO requires peacekeepers to carry out operations in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law as applicable. Peacekeepers are able to use LOAC principles and standards by analogy to protect victims of armed conflict, such as creating protected areas. So, of course, the law of armed conflict has a role to play. The main controversy is, when does that law apply specifically to peacekeepers? When are they bound by those principles? And I'm happy to talk about that during question time. My own attitude towards it, and this goes back to Rita's point about, harmonizing or the interplay between human rights and UDHR and the law of armed conflict, is that they're not binary choices, nor are they choices that completely blend together as if we're talking the same language. They require a certain deal of imagination, a certain deal of intellectual rigor, a certain deal of understanding how politics and politics will play out for states in particular when they bring these regimes together. And so I want to throw out the challenge that really there's room to think about the way that these laws interact in a sui generis manner. And my example, or the inspiration to think about the law in a sui generis manner, is, of course, the legal framework created for the protection of UN personnel first, and even before that, diplomatic privileges for UN personnel. Now, that regime, the Convention on Diplomatic privileges for UN, for the UN itself as an organization and its personnel, came about obviously from the general law of diplomatic immunity, but they created it specifically in an imaginative way to apply to international organizations. And now no one questions that regime. So it's that shifting the conversation to understand that you can't fit square pegs into round holes, and then thinking about how you can make the regimes function in this, very, very challenging environments we face today.
Steve?
Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the most dear anniversary for us would be the Geneva Conventions as well. But just to endorse, I think, what Oz has just said and also what Rita said, I really think that the debate around the interaction between IHL or LOAC is really in need of a jump start and really a focus on practical application. So I endorse what both Rita and Oz said in that regard. I think that's why you need coalition, and that's why you need multinational operations. Because it's easy to talk about these things in a theoretical way, but ultimately the rubber only hits the road, as it were, when you're actually doing, as the United States, multinational and or coalition operations, including within NATO. And of course, NATO executes the mandates, from the UN, for example, so in the peacekeeping context or in a more of a collective self-defense context. So I always say that the value of the institutions for the United States is that it helps the United States get out of these horrible Manichaean debates about the application of IHL on one hand and human rights law on the other hand. You actually can work together with states that have completely different views about that fundamental issue, that have totally different legal obligations. And you can do it, and you can be successful, and you can actually be the strongest alliance in history. And I think that's a positive message that I think we should try to take forward as an international law community on the occasion of these important anniversaries. There are so many practical ideas. There's the things like the Copenhagen principles in the area of detention. There's things like in use ad bellum, you have the Bethlehem principles. You have many of these kinds of things that I think should be the focus for the future work. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Steve. Michael, we are nearing our question and answer time, so if you could be brief, that would be
Sure, I'll be very brief. The one identifies the Genocide Convention, and the sometimes not fully appreciated ways in which R2P, the responsibility to protect doctrine, built upon it, dealt with some of its problems, and offered a way forward for humanitarian protection. And I mention it now because it's being knocked back on its heels somewhat, including by colleagues in the UN, but it's very important. Genocide, of course, the convention was a landmark in advancing humanitarian protection in the aftermath of when it was most needed. But it also ran into problems with regard to proving intentionality, for example, and the particular elements that have to be invoked to prove it. Invoking the G word almost prevented it from being used in a number of contexts. And the virtue of R2P that went through the General Assembly in the summer of 2005 is that it provided a coherent and a reasonable broadening of what we should be concerned about, to include not just genocide, but also war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. So by broadening the elements, we had a framework, an intellectual framework for a better regime of protection. And that was a genuine step forward. It had to be interpreted, it wasn't a treaty, as an advance within the interpretation of Article 39, which is a very reasonable way to read that capacious article, to say that this now also could be considered part of international peace and security. All those accomplishments, in my mind, from a doctrinal point of view, are very real and worth protecting. Unfortunately, there are problems within the UN where sorting out the regimes for protection of civilians and R2P have yet to be fully accomplished. And institutionally, the role of the advisors for genocide and R2P are a model of bureaucratic incoherence and underfunding. So we haven't fully taken advantage of the value of R2P, but I see this as a very positive doctrinal addition to the landmark commitments in the Genocide Convention.
Thank you. Well, it probably is a comment on an entirely different set of developments recently, that no one took up the challenge of talking about international criminal law in respect to the regimes, particularly given that Ozzy had talked about accountability as one of the three most important aspects of peacekeeping, but maybe that's another panel for another time. I have lots of other questions. One of the ones that I was quite interested in talking about was challenges that haven't been addressed. Climate change was mentioned, but we really haven't talked about how that relates to the security issues here. Non-state actors, similar emerging technologies. There are many things out there. But you have all been incredibly patient, and it is your turn. Anyone who would like to ask a question, please line up. Please, as always, keep your questions brief and succinct. This is a time for questions, not comments. Also, I will try to reframe the questions if needed to assure that all of our panelists remain part of the discussion. Thank you. Lori.
I'm Lori Damrosch. I'm a past president of the Society. Thank you very much. It's a brilliant panel, and all five of you have made very enlightening remarks. My ears perked up when Rita mentioned the fact that the Universal Declaration has been translated into 500 languages, and one of the other human rights organizations, not the one that you're associated with, has actually modernized it, not only in gender terms, but actually in content terms. And I find that very revealing that there are ideas that were expressed in 1948 that can be expressed very differently, and it's almost as if you were going from the priesthood to the vernacular to reach out to people so that they can understand the concepts the way they want to understand them today. So then my ears perked up again when Steve mentioned état de droit. And we had the first use of French in this annual meeting, and I think that's really important. And then my ears perked up again when Michael was talking about the Gorbachev era, because it was my privilege to direct a US-Soviet research project during that era, which then became a US-Russian and other research project, and we talked a lot about pravavoye gasudarstva, and a state based on the rule of law. But what Gorbachev was actually talking about was the primacy of law in international relations, and that's actually a different concept from the rule of law in domestic affairs. So I think in line with the themes that all of you have brought out about the interconnections among these regimes and how we really need to have the rule of law at home in order to have the rule of law in international relations. My question, then question mark, is just for further reflection on integrating the rule of law domestically with the rule of law internationally, and anything else relevant to the multiple languages in which we try to speak international law, as to which the centennial toast given in 1906 and 2006 was "To a just world under law." That's sort of the motto of the society.
That's great. And I think I'm going to take 2 questions at a time. I see 4 people in line, and I think we'll have time for 2 rounds. So yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Juan Antonio Yáñez. I'm a former Spanish ambassador to the United Nations, among several other things. And I thank all the speakers for talking very eloquently, and also about what at first puzzled me as very different legal regimes, but you managed in putting them together in a very creative way. Now, let me add some other dimensions to those that were mentioned that were also in my mind, but more particularly in the continent of Europe, where I come from. Mr. Hill is right that NATO preceded the European community, etc. But NATO was preceded by the Brussels Treaty, which was the first defense organization in Europe after the war, and then morphed into the Western European Organization, which later on became a part of the European Union. Maybe with the Brexit, we have to reform the Western European Union. We don't know yet. But this brings me to some other things, like the Council of Europe. Council of Europe was established in 1949, and it was the European House, not only for human rights, but also for the rule of law and for democracy. And it was because that house was there that after the end of the Cold War, the first Cold War, many Eastern European countries, well, including even Russia, entered the Council of Europe, and now it's a bigger European house. But this brings me to something that was mentioned at some moments, but maybe needs some further discussion: the interaction between the universal and the regional. Also, well, behind me, I think somebody is going to speak about the Organization of American States, which was also born 70 years ago, more or less. And I think there are different kinds of interactions, interrelations between the two types of multilateralism that in principle should not be opposed, but should be in a sort of creative tension between them. Thank you.
Excellent. Let's try to see if, rather than all 5 of us talking at either of those questions, does someone want to respond to one of them? Yes, Michael.
One, very briefly on Lori's very important point, on the relationship between the domestic rule of law and the international rule of law. It sort of, as I see it, it depends upon the law. That is, for some forms of law, human rights law, the relationship is extremely intimate. That is, unless you have a regime that is protecting human rights domestically, you're not going to be a credible advocate and or potentially even enforcer of human rights internationally, nor will you be part of the regime in any self-respecting fashion. On the other hand, when it comes to international financial law or international commercial law, non-rights abiding states often do very well. I remember at a conference many years ago when there was a discussion about the rise of solidarity to potential democratic rule in Poland. I was sitting next to a banker who said, I won't give the exact phrase because it was expletive. And I asked him, why? Well, aren't you cheering on solidarity? He says, communists pay their debts, was his response. And so you don't need to have all international rule of law be homogeneous, but for some it's very important, others less so.
Anyone want to respond to the second question? Or
Sure, and I want to thank the questioner who's back in the audience. Yeah, there you are. Thank you. Yeah, for mentioning the Brussels Agreement. Actually, I mean, this is an example of the use of language actually from one treaty bringing into another. And I think there's actually a lot more cross-pollination from the 1948-1949 period, among other things, because I think the legal departments of these MFAs were probably very, very small. And so it was a lot of the same people that were working on all these things. Also, the Rio Pact, I see Christina is there. We're going to probably mention the Organization of American States, but the NATO treaty is also influenced by the U.S. and experience with regard to Western Hemisphere defense. But just to say, I mean, maybe add an organization that you didn't mention, Ambassador, the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, for which has a very important and very innovative, interesting role, for example, in Ukraine now and with respect to some of these other conflicts. And so I agree, I mean, maybe it's a creative tension, or it's just trying to figure out what's the right kind of niche for these various organizations that we have as part of our security architecture. And that kind of optimization is actually very much on the agenda, I think, of a lot of people today. I mentioned the real efforts that we're making to cooperate with the European Union, including in the area of European defense. I mean, I don't think the United States has anything to fear about your discussions around European defense. It's not going to supplant NATO. It's in the Lisbon Treaty that this will not affect NATO obligations. I think it's only in the interest of the international community writ large to really reinforce this work together. Thank you.
thank you. And I really liked the observation about perhaps one way to frame what we're talking about is really exploring the relationships between the universal and the regional. I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it. We'll take two more questions.
My name is Christina Cerna, and my career was with the OAS. And although I wasn't going to refer to the OAS, I can't resist. And just to point out that Article 5, the most important article in the NATO treaty, derives from the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. But I do have two short questions. One on accountability of peacekeeping. It was notorious that peacekeepers brought cholera into Haiti. How did that come out? Philip Alston called for reparation. I don't know how it ended. And secondly, with respect to human rights and NATO, since the European Court of Human Rights does not have jurisdiction over the United States, it has gone after European countries like Lithuania, Macedonia, for being the locus of enhanced interrogation techniques or torture in Europe. How has NATO or the different countries in NATO responded to that?
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Angela Muluguti, and I'm an international criminal justice lawyer at the YMO Foundation. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. My question is for Professor Oswald. You've highlighted that UN peacekeeping operations are regulated and governed by very robust laws as far as human rights is concerned. But the situation on the ground is very different. I was in the Central African Republic 2 months ago, where the UN peacekeeping force is stretched incredibly thin, and even worse, the allegations of sexual exploitation and violations continue. So having served on the ground yourself, what are we missing? What is not trickling down between the policy and the reality on the ground to prevent, in particular, sexual exploitation? Thank you.
Okay, I think we start with Ozzy, and Rita, I'm going to ask you if you have any response to this, just by way of a heads up, and then I think there's a NATO question there.
Thanks for both those questions, and both go obviously to the heart of the credibility of the United Nations, the credibility of peacekeepers, and I dare say the credibility of member states that contribute peacekeepers to those missions. It also goes to the credibility of organizations like the Committee 34, which deals with lots of these questions in its when it meets through the General Assembly framework. The accountability of peacekeepers for bringing cholera to Haiti. There's, of course, the famous Philip Alston report where he criticizes the UN for not making amends or giving reparations. And, obviously that's a very, very strong report that he's written. For me, as a black letter law issue, this relates to third-party liability and the UN's obligation to pay for, through the construct of privileges and immunities that it has, to pay for the consequences of its operations that arise directly from its operations. I don't know where that issue now rests. I must admit that I've lost track of it. In relation to sexual exploitation and abuse, so this became a very, very, I mean, obviously it's always a very important issue, but it came to light in Cambodia during the peace operation there when the Secretary General, a special representative of the Secretary General, allegedly said to a newspaper reporter when asked about the sexual exploitation abuse that was happening in Cambodia, that boys will be boys. That was reported, it went through the UN system, and then it took a number of years for a report to be undertaken formally through the UN system, which was the Zaid report. That report tried to influence sexual exploitation and abuse policy and to hold peacekeepers more accountable. Through the UN system, there's been no development for member states to actually accept that responsibility framework where they've created a way of prosecuting apart from their domestic law. So that, the UN's view is this is a domestic law issue, try and sort it out. Having said that, that is not to say that the Secretary General has not made numerous attempts by creating policy and by shaping arguments, including binding policy on member states, to ensure that anyone accused of sexual exploitation and abuse is investigated and where there's sufficient evidence to prosecute them. So the Memorandum of Understanding entered between the member state and the UN actually creates that obligation. Last but not least, the normative strength of the Security Council issuing a resolution on this point, I think goes a long way to reshaping the debate. Again, I'm not a pessimist on this issue. It's been incremental, sometimes one step forward and then two steps back, but slowly but surely in the 25 years that I've been working in this field, I have seen the conversation being lifted. I've seen the conversation being much more in the public fora, and I've seen the Security Council now, through that resolution, pushing forward the debate that it's taking sexual exploitation and abuse seriously, and the vetting of peacekeepers in that context very, very seriously.
Very good. Rita?
Yeah, so I think, Christine Cerno raised, the decisions, the European Court of Human Rights, and to me that sort of goes back to Lori's point as well about this relationship between accountability at the international level and then also at the domestic level. And I think these kinds of decisions and mechanisms within the regional systems like the European Court of Human Rights or the complaint mechanism under the ICCPR, these are really critical leverage points that get back to what Stephen was talking about earlier when we were operating in these coalitions. These give advocates that work in the space that I do the ability to point to these kinds of decisions at the international or regional level to bring it back to the practical, real-world interoperability problems. If your allies and partners that you're working with, if they're being held to account, even if the U.S. isn't bound by these. So I think it's a really important tool, going back to the theme of this conference of international law as an instrument or as a tool. Those mechanisms serve as a really, really important tool. But I think also separately, there's a lot more for us to be doing to bring these international standards home. And one of the favorite things that I do is teach on the side, and teach a use of force class right now at Georgetown Law School. And we have our students read many of the international documents and standards with respect to the use of force, the UN principles, the use of force in firearms. They look at, the McCann case, but then we also have them look at domestic cases on the use of force by law enforcement officers. And the students are just dumbfounded by the wait, but then you have these standards and they're not really applied or considered or part of the conversation in how we think about these standards and how they're force is used at home. And I think that's a place where we have a lot more work to do to actually fully integrate those standards into our domestic systems, that's really how human rights law is supposed to work. It's important that you have accountability at the international level, but by design, the real accountability is supposed to be happening at the domestic level.
So we've moved from universal to regional to local. I'd like you to ask your question very quickly, and then that will allow the panelists, including the NATO response, in a last round. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kimberly Brown. I'm an Obama Scholar at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. My question pertains to Resolution 1325. We're also approaching a 20-year anniversary of women in peace and security. And I'd be interested, both from a practitioner lens as well as an institutional lens from NATO, how are these paradigms that are being implemented? We're seeing a lot of national governments implement national action plans, but what is the conversation in terms of implementation by both practitioners on the ground as well as institutional approaches? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you brought that up. My center is working on a project on women, peace, and security, trying to identify barriers to both entry and advancement among women in NATO force countries. And so that's one of very, very many facets of that agenda. And so I hope that someone on the panel will take up a further discussion in response to that question. But I think I'm going to start with you, Steve. Christine had left a question on the table, and then anything you want to say by way of summary.
Sure. Well, I mean, the easy way for me to answer your question, Christina, is I mean, I'm not aware that those things relate to NATO operations, so it's not really within the scope of my mandate to comment on that. I mean, in a way, I think the fact that I mean, within our organization, the compliance with international law is the responsibility, as it well should be, of each individual nation. And so the way in which they handle that, including with respect to judicial proceedings, is for them to comment on. Less of a bureaucratic response. It's really all about, I think, as everyone's been saying here, how do you take these international standards, be it in the area of use of force or things like women, peace, and security, UN Resolution 1325, and how do you get that implemented nationally? And I would just, while I think from a legal perspective, NATO has traditionally not looked at itself as a regional organization within the sense of Chapter 8 of the UN Charter. That's actually an agreed minute that was made around the time of the negotiation of the North Atlantic Treaty. I mean, regardless of that, I think NATO very much sees its role as a way of interpreting and translating the universal standards into the allies, and doing so in a very practical way. So thank you, Kimberly, for mentioning the national action plans. We are having a national action plan review conference. So to answer your question, what are we doing in May in order to ask each ally to explain exactly where it is on these national action plans, on the different commitments that have been made in those plans. We are working together with many different actors about specific ways to deal with women's participation, for example, in military forces. The numbers are very low, but are coming up, and how to integrate that work throughout our organization. That's something that my Secretary General is very, very committed to. I should say also, there's a lot of, perhaps people don't realize, there's a lot of discussion and interplay amongst organizations that operate on a regional level. So there's a good amount of work between NATO and the African Union. For example, I know that the African Union Legal Council is here on issues like women, peace, and security, on certain elements of advice about how peacekeeping can be carried out at the regional level, about how to improve kind of the nuts and bolts things. So I don't know, I think in the end, and by way of summary, Diane, for NATO, I think the 70th anniversary is kind of the time to reflect on how we, despite these really often seemingly difficult differences in legal regimes applicable in the Allies or legal position, we managed to achieve a high level of interoperability and work together. And it's basically by what I would call tending the garden of multilateralism. It's the kind of day-to-day spade work on things that are usually not very glamorous, to be perfectly honest with you, that I think proves the value of these multilateral institutions even at the age of 70.
That's great. We have 45 seconds. So the way that I am going to finish it up is to ask each of the remaining 3 panelists to fill in the blank. The 70th anniversary of my regime is a good opportunity to blank.
Consider accountability more deeply.
Thank you. Yes.
That's a hard one. I like the consider accountability more deeply, but I think it's an opportunity to continue the full realization of all of the rights articulated in the Declaration.
Thank you.
To take whatever we can do to mitigate and reduce the chances of a new Cold War.
And so we end where we started. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. Please thank the roundtable participants.